As a non-Indigenous woman, I grew up in Cambridge, Ontario, settled along the Grand River and about half an hour from the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. Growing up, I had no knowledge that my city was located along the Haldimand Tract, or that only a few kilometers away was a residential school, the Mohawk Institute Residential School. Following the American Revolution, Sir Frederick Haldimand, Governor-in-Chief of Canada, granted to the Six Nations of the Iroquois a tract of land extending for 6 miles on both sides of the Grand River from its source to Lake Erie. This grant was made in recognition of their services as allies of the British Crown during the war and to recompense them for the loss of their former lands in northern New York State. It wasn't until my time at Laurier Brantford that I was introduced to what a residential school was, which is when I went on a field trip to the Mohawk Institute Residential School for a tour, and my interest in Indigenous education began. The residential school era, which can be said to have begun in 1874, is one example of the racist policies that were imposed on Indigenous peoples. Designed to strip Indigenous peoples of their identity, languages, and culture, the residential schools were administered by the Government of Canada and run by Roman Catholic and Anglican churches. By the time the last residential school closed in 1996, over 100,000 Indigenous children had been removed from their homes without warrant. The Mohawk Institute was the oldest continuously operated residential school in Canada, running from 1828 to 1970. This photo shows Native students gathered in the basement of the Mohawk Institute, commonly known as the Mush hole for the food that was served there. After the closing of the Mohawk Institute in 1970, the building was reopened in October 1973 under the direction of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians as the Woodland Cultural Center. The center is now a museum and art gallery. Reclaiming the space challenges the general public's views that Indigenous cultures are static and merely existed in the past. It challenges curator-controlled presentations of Indigenous peoples' past to a more inclusive and collaborative process. Reclaiming the space of the former residential school connects with self-determination and addressing the power relations between Indigenous peoples and the colonizer, as well as the 4 R's: respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relevance.
Established in 1972, the Woodland Cultural Center has been an integral cultural and educational center within the Brantford and Six Nations communities. Residing on the grounds and in the buildings of the former residential school, Woodland now hosts a museum with several permanent and short-term exhibits, an extensive library, an educational outreach program, and a language resource center to preserve the native languages for future generations. Contact us today to join our several...
Over 35,000 artifacts are a part of the collection at the museum, making it one of the largest facilities in Canada managed and administered by First Nations. The museum holdings include archaeological specimens, ethnological materials, historical material, documents, furniture, contemporary paintings, drawings, graphics, sculptures, photographs, fine arts, and contemporary installations.
My name is Geronimo Henry from the Cayuga Nation. I came to the school here, this Mohawk Institute Residential School in November 11th, 1942, and I left in 1952 when I was 5 until I was 16. Everybody had a number here. A Mohawk Residential School, number 48. They prevented me from learning my language and my culture. If you take your language away from a person, then you take everything. That's what I think.
Scano, Kanawiyosta ni Gyazo, Yagwai ni Wagishauda, Kayakono ni Wakwenzoda. Owade, it's windy. Owade. Total swing of that pendulum from one, extreme to the other where in this building they were punished for speaking their language.
This might have been my myth when I was a kid.
It's our traditional people who really were the backbone of keeping that language alive.
Franny, she's a faith keeper at one of the longhouses. And I think maybe that's why she wanted to take the language up. I'm glad it's being revived, and yeah, I think it's really great. This morning I got up and I looked out the sun. I seen the sun. We haven't seen him for a couple of days, and I said, "Scano ade ka gagwa." So that means hello, the sun.
Good evening. 15,000 students went to the Mohawk Institute Residential School. It's now called the Woodland Cultural Centre. Now, out of 130 residential schools that operated in Canada, it's one of less than 10 still standing. Now, I spoke to the centre's executive director today, who was in Ottawa. He referred to it as a historic occasion, saying the report and recommendations were everything he hoped they would be.
I think it's an untold story, right? It's untold history of this country. We were shamed into saying, "Oh, don't say anything about it." Shh. You know? And then those students that went there, they were told that they couldn't, it was indoctrinated. They were indoctrinated as saying, "Don't ever say whatever happened in here. Don't go home." Well, a lot of them never went home because, because of the way it happened. You know? And it was 7 generations of students that went through that school when you think about it. I think for survivors, it helps them to forgive. There's still a long road for a lot of them to get to that level of forgiveness.
Amos Key says there is a huge demand when it comes to people wanting to tour the building, and they're working on a campaign to restore it to a museum to look like what the school looked like. Now, he says the building tells a very important story. I'll send it back to you.
It certainly does. Thanks so much, Brittany.
By reclaiming the space, survivors have a voice. They are able to come to the Woodland Cultural Centre and share their stories. On September 30th, 2017, hundreds of residential school survivors from across Ontario and Quebec returned to Brantford to take part in a healing walk on the site of the former residential school.
Ani, danze, hi, scano swagwego. Hello. It is time to heal the wounds of our collective humanity, and it's incumbent upon all of us to come to grips with the negligence of actions and inactions regarding the history of Canadian Indian residential schools, so we can collectively honor the sacrifice of these young people who attended them by telling their stories of their lost innocence and by sharing the legacy and elegance of their grace. In doing so, we honor the hope of those who endured and survived, and we immortalize the convictions of those who perished trying to understand. As Canadians and First Nations together, we will not only illuminate this part of Canada and Ontario's history, but more importantly, we'll illuminate the civil, social, and human rights of First Nations citizens and the collective intellect found in the intelligences of their living civilizations. By doing so, we can each begin to cauterize these festering civil wounds and begin to limit this human toll so we can move to heal our collective humanity and instruct our collective memories to never forget. Now we need your help in restoring and preserving this important legacy in Canadian and First Nations history through the restoration of the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School, one of less than 10 still standing in Canada. If you would like to...
The former residential school has been reclaimed and taken back and made into a healing space. Reclaiming the former residential school acknowledges McCarty and Lee's culturally sustaining, revitalizing pedagogy by recognizing the need to reclaim and revitalize what has been disrupted and displaced by colonization.